I am a 35-year-old man who is happily married to my wonderful wife, who is 34. She is the loving mother of our two beautiful daughters, aged 6 and 3. Our story began in our hometown, where we first met and started dating in high school. We were high school sweethearts, sharing a bond that many find enviable. Our relationship continued to flourish as we both attended the same college, maintaining our connection throughout those years. Eventually, we got engaged and, after graduation, celebrated our love by getting married. To some, our journey together might seem like a fairy tale. Reflecting on my family, I recall my father, who was always a devoted dad to my sister and me. He had his flaws, particularly his temper and his tendency to drink too much. Despite these issues, he loved us deeply and never caused us any harm. His dedication to our well-being and his affectionate nature left a lasting impression on me. This has influenced how I approach my own role as a father and husband, striving to create a loving and supportive environment for my family. The shadow of my father's infidelity loomed large over our young marriage. Even as a child, I'd witnessed the tumultuous period when he strayed from my mother, a period that coincided with my wife and I beginning our relationship. Back then, my parents' marriage teetered on the brink. Business woes fueled by a dishonest partner entangled him in legal battles, leading to financial turmoil. Anger became his constant companion, manifesting in excessive drinking and hurtful words. My mother, an embodiment of patience, held him up emotionally despite the strain. Yet it wasn't enough. He strayed, violating the vows they'd made. My mother, an angel in disguise, forgave him. However, his betrayal wasn't a one-time lapse. After a brief separation and a reconciliation, the cycle repeated. While I suspect there were more affairs, to my knowledge, two scarred their journey. It was during this tumultuous period that my then-girlfriend, now wife, and I met in college. One summer, she returned home to take classes at the local community college, a cost-effective way to further her education. While she resided at her parents' house, I remained at our regular college, tackling my coursework. This was also the time when my father, having lost a receptionist, suggested my wife take the position. It seemed like a perfect solution. Extra income for her, a helping hand for him. I enthusiastically relayed the opportunity, and she readily agreed, drawn to the flexible hours. After our wedding, a subtle shift emerged in my wife's demeanor towards my father. She expressed unease, a distrust rooted in his past infidelities. While I understood his failings and the deep hurt he'd inflicted on my mother, I also recognized his emotional insecurity as a mitigating factor. My wife's perspective, however, fueled my own resentment towards him. But if my mother, the woman most wronged, could forgive him, shouldn't I? The birth of our daughter brought a new layer of complexity. My wife expressed discomfort leaving our child alone with my father, but only when my mother wasn't present. Confused, I pressed for clarification. It was then, after persistent questioning, that a long-buried secret surfaced. My wife revealed that during her summer working for my father years ago, he'd engaged in inappropriate flirtation. The betrayal cut deep. She claimed to have moved on, but the experience left her with a lingering distrust. Torn between anger and the desire to protect my mother, I kept this revelation a secret. Confronting my father wouldn't change the past, and I knew he'd likely deny it, creating an untenable rift. But the thought of my mother, already burdened by his past, being further shaken by our lack of trust was unbearable. So we carried this weight, a silent barrier poisoning what should have been a joyous time. The shadow of his infidelity had stretched far, casting a long and unsettling darkness over our lives. The weight of a dark secret had festered within our marriage for years, a silent tumor slowly eroding my trust. We danced around the topic of seeking counseling, the unspoken truth lingering in the air like a storm cloud just beyond the horizon. But the storm finally broke, not in a fit of rage, but on the tide of too much celebratory wine on our 11th anniversary. As the inhibitions loosened with each clink of glasses, my wife's voice, usually laced with a practiced cheer, trembled with a newfound vulnerability. What she revealed shattered the carefully constructed narrative I'd held about my father's past infidelity. His inappropriate behavior towards her, initially dismissed as mere flirtation, had morphed into something far more sinister. Her words, raw and painful, painted a picture of escalating harassment. From unwelcome hugs and kisses to unwanted physical contact, her boundaries were repeatedly violated. My father, the man I knew to be capable of betrayal, had targeted the woman I loved, using his authority to manipulate her into uncomfortable situations. She confessed to a paralyzing fear, a reluctance to explicitly reject his advances for fear of jeopardizing our relationship and the fragile peace within our family. The guilt gnawed at her, a burden she carried silently for years. There were instances she described where she'd attempted to resist, where she'd expressed discomfort, but never a definitive no. An emotional tightrope walk, desperate to maintain a semblance of normalcy while trapped in a situation she didn't know how to escape. The tipping point arrived when his predatory behavior reached a horrifying climax. The details, too graphic to articulate, left me reeling with a cocktail of emotions: devastation, disbelief, and a white-hot rage that threatened to consume me. Here was the man I'd harbored a simmering resentment towards for years, the man who'd inflicted such pain on my mother, now exposed for the serial predator he truly was. My wife, despite never explicitly saying no, had finally found the strength to walk away, to escape his web of manipulation. Leaving her job, she slammed the door shut on that chapter of her life, but the emotional scars remained. My anger burned like an inferno, a desire for justice warring with the knowledge that dredging up the past wouldn't erase the trauma. My wife, with a strength I couldn't fathom, insisted she'd moved on, refusing to revisit the emotional abyss. Yet, the echo of her pain resonated within me, transforming the resentment towards my father into a deep, festering hatred. The desire for answers, for a more detailed account of those harrowing days, collided with her need for closure. The guilt of forcing her to confront the memories she'd buried deep threatened to suffocate me. So we walked a tightrope once again, me yearning for a complete picture, her determined to keep the past at bay. The future stretched before us, an uncertain landscape forever altered by this revelation. The man I once called father now represented a monstrous betrayal, a stain on our family tapestry. The path forward would be paved with navigating her unspoken pain and my simmering rage, a constant reminder of the dark secret that almost destroyed us. The revelation had ripped a gaping hole in the fabric of my reality. My wife, the woman I loved, had been the victim of a monstrous betrayal by the one person she should have been able to trust, my own father. The dissonance was deafening. Guilt gnawed at me for experiencing flashes of anger towards her. Here she was, a mere 21-year-old navigating the treacherous waters of a relationship with her boyfriend's father, a man a full 30 years her senior. He was both her lover and her boss, a position that should have provided a sense of safety, not become a weapon for coercion. Yet a nagging dissonance echoed in my mind. Her strength and independence, qualities I admired deeply, seemed to contradict the narrative of repeated manipulation. She had always been one to stand up for herself, unafraid of confrontation. So why, in this instance, had her voice been silenced? I forced myself to detach from the blame game, recognizing the unfairness of adding guilt to her already heavy burden. It was a struggle. Her resilience, a stark contrast to my own emotional turmoil, added another layer of confusion. Here she was, recounting a horrific ordeal with an unsettling calmness, almost detached, while I was a wreck, a blubbering mess drowning in a sea of anger and despair. This calmness, however, fueled a creeping suspicion. The repeated incidents, the escalating nature of his advances, all pointed towards a period of prolonged discomfort, one she could have, perhaps should have, ended sooner. The possibility of a deeper complicity, a thought I immediately recoiled from, gnawed at the edges of my mind. Could there be more to the story? Was there some hidden truth she hesitated to reveal, fearing the potential fallout? The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken. Knowing the damage dredging up the past could inflict on our families, I understood her desire for a limited circle of knowledge. Still, the uncertainty festered, a silent scream echoing in the quiet spaces between us. 13 years she had carried this burden alone, her strength a mask for the emotional devastation lurking beneath. The lack of the expected emotional fireworks, the absence of tears mirroring my own, left me adrift. Had she buried the trauma so deep that it manifested in a chilling numbness? Was there a part of her wrestling with her own culpability, a delayed recognition of her inability to set clear boundaries? The path forward was shrouded in uncertainty. As I grappled with my own cocktail of emotions, I yearned to see a flicker of shared pain in her eyes, a validation of the horror we'd both acknowledged. Instead, I was left with a tangled mess of unanswered questions and a profound sense of betrayal, not just from my father, but from the very nature of trust itself. The weight of this revelation settled upon me like a thick fog, obscuring my understanding. Perhaps it was my own processing timeline clouding my judgment. This event, buried in the recesses of her past for over a decade, was a fresh wound for me. The vast difference in our journeys of coping fueled a nagging uncertainty. My initial anxieties about her response were, as she gently explained, likely a product of the differing ways we navigate trauma. She, the long-suffering victim, had built a wall around the incident, while I, a recent recipient of this horrifying truth, was drowning in a sea of emotions. Her story, finally unraveled, painted a picture of a predator preying on vulnerability. My father, a man I held in a twisted sense of affection despite his flaws, was revealed as a manipulator driven by insecurity. He wielded his charm and persistence like weapons, ensnaring her in a web of discomfort. She described a chilling paralysis, a desperate hope that his unwanted advances, once endured, would simply cease. The details which she rightfully chose to spare me further illustrated her attempts to avoid these encounters. Yet the relentless pursuit continued. Cards, flowers, suggestive messages, all instruments of his twisted pursuit. The word affair echoed in my mind, a discordant note in this symphony of betrayal. Without the context of the pressure, the fear, the manipulation, it was easy to misinterpret her narrative. Years later, the emotional weight of those moments had shifted, replaced by a steely resolve. Yesterday, I confessed my inability to comprehend her apparent lack of hatred towards him. She, with a strength I envied, responded with a quiet acceptance. Hatred, she explained, was a burden she'd long since shed. Her focus now was on protecting our family, limiting exposure to his toxicity. Confrontation, she wisely advised, would only stir a hornet's nest of negativity. While she'd navigated this trauma with remarkable grace, I floundered. This revelation, a sucker punch to my carefully constructed reality, landed with a devastating blow. My father, a flawed but familiar figure, was now a stranger cloaked in deceit. The love I nurtured for him, already strained, fractured further. The potential devastation this news would wreak on my mother, a woman who had endured his philandering for years, added another layer of complexity. My wife, a beacon of strength in this storm, urged me to respect her wishes for a limited circle of knowledge. There would be no public pronouncements, no accusations hurled. The years of seemingly normal interactions they'd shared, the vacations, the holidays, all took on a new, unsettling light. The secret she'd carried like a stone in her shoe, the practiced neutrality in his presence, were testaments to her silent struggle. The path forward shimmered in the distance, shrouded in uncertainty. I needed time to reconcile the father I thought I knew with the monster he truly was. Honoring my wife's wishes while navigating this emotional minefield would be a delicate dance. The support I'd received in the aftermath of this revelation was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this journey of confronting a painful truth. The unanswered questions gnawed at me like a persistent itch. My mind fixated on that fateful night at his office, replaying it over and over in a distorted loop. Why didn't she just leave? Surely, there were other ways to avoid that drive, that forced proximity. The narrative blurred between understanding and disbelief. Grasping the concept of unwanted touches, fleeting kisses, was one thing. But how did it spiral so far out of control? How did a young woman trapped in an uncomfortable work situation find herself teetering on the brink of intimacy? Clothes shed, boundaries shattered? Her words, relayed with a quiet resignation, echoed in my mind. It would be wrong. But in the heat of the moment, those words hadn't been enough. A part of me, a begrudging part, understood the pressure she was under. Yet another part, the fiercely protective husband, couldn't reconcile the passivity with the severity of the situation. Seeking further clarification, I approached her again, the weight of unanswered questions hanging heavy between us. This constant revisiting of the past, a raw wound reopened 100 times in a matter of days, was taking its toll. My need for answers, however, was a festering abscess that demanded lancing. Her explanation, a torrent of emotions finally released, painted a clearer picture of the ordeal. It wasn't one singular event, but a series of escalating incidents. Repeated advances, invitations to a deserted office, all diligently deflected on her part. However, there were those moments of isolation, those times when escape wasn't an option. Those were the moments he seized. He initiated everything, his touch unwelcome, intrusive. The details, though mercifully spared, hinted at a chilling desperation on his part. She resisted, a desperate dance between fear and compliance. The line between acquiescence and choice blurred, a consequence of the impossible situation she found herself in. There was no reveling in recounting this ordeal. The burden of the past, carried in silence for over a decade, had finally been released. The regret in her voice, though unspoken, was palpable. This revelation, intended to be a cathartic release, had instead become a source of unexpected pain for both of us. The tipping point, the moment she finally asserted her will, was shrouded in a fog of discomfort. It wasn't about violence, she explained, but about a forceful transgression of boundaries. The word assault seemed too harsh, a violence she hadn't experienced. Yet the violation, the manipulation, was undeniable. Any hope of seeking justice, of confronting my father, was quickly extinguished. She vehemently opposed it. The denial, the inevitable drama, were predictable. It wouldn't change the past, only jeopardize the fragile peace we had built. The cost would be the destruction of our relationships with both my parents, a devastating domino effect. Our prearranged trip loomed large, a stark reminder of the normalcy we desperately craved. Canceling, a logical step given the circumstances, would raise suspicions, cast a shadow on our already strained family dynamic. There were obligations, commitments we couldn't just walk away from. The prospect of riding in my father's RV, sharing close quarters for days with the man who had violated my wife's trust, filled me with dread. Yet the alternative, breaking the news, shattering my daughter's excitement, and causing a rift with my cousin on his wedding day, was equally unpalatable. We were caught in a vise of our own making, the weight of this revelation threatening to derail a carefully planned event. The path forward required a delicate balance, navigating emotional turmoil while maintaining a semblance of normalcy. The truth, this monstrous truth that my wife had revealed, hung in the air like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Confronting my father, demanding answers, was a burning necessity for me. Yet my wife approached this ordeal with a disarming calmness that sent shivers down my spine. Here she was, the woman I loved, the one who'd endured this violation, seemingly unfazed. The details she recounted, the physical intimacy, the near breach of a sacred line, played on a loop in my mind, a constant reminder of the betrayal. But her nonchalant demeanor left me bewildered. Was this a coping mechanism, a wall built after years of silent struggle? Or something more sinister, a chilling echo of Stockholm Syndrome? The impact on me, the emotional upheaval that threatened to consume me, seemed lost on her. My father, the man I'd idolized despite his flaws, was now revealed as a predator. The justifications I'd constructed around his infidelity, a weak mother, my own shortcomings, crumbled to dust. Cutting ties with him, severing the already strained bond, was no easy feat. His access to my daughters, these innocent beings I fiercely protected, was now a terrifying prospect. But how could I reconcile the man who'd violated my wife's trust with the role of a grandfather? Her unwavering opposition to further investigation fueled a growing suspicion. Accepting her narrative on blind faith, particularly in light of my father's reputation as a womanizer, felt wrong. A womanizer, yes, but a predator targeting his son's girlfriend? There was a chasm of difference, and my gut screamed that something didn't add up. The impending trip loomed large, a microcosm of the larger reality we faced. Packing for the journey, a shared activity usually filled with anticipation, was now shrouded in a heavy silence. My wife, oblivious to the storm brewing within me, busied herself with the children. My father, pulling up in his RV, oblivious to the accusations hanging in the air, greeted me with a casual wave. The urge to confront him, to unleash the torrent of emotions swirling within me, was a constant battle. But without concrete evidence, who would I even accuse? My wife, despite my unwavering belief in her, had offered an account with inconsistencies. Years of silence, of allowing this to continue, clouded her narrative. Why now after all this time? Was there something more, something she wasn't revealing? Perhaps a recent incident, a trigger that unearthed the buried trauma. Every attempt to broach the subject with her was met with deflection, a retreat into a calmness that felt eerily unnatural. The truth, I realized, was a tangled web, and I was determined to unravel it, thread by thread. The disquiet gnawed at me, a persistent itch beneath the surface of normalcy. Dad's arrival only intensified it. Questions hung heavy in the air, unspoken accusations swirling between us. I swallowed them, opting for a fragile facade of normalcy as we packed the RV. The familiar routine offered a sliver of comfort, the south coast our departure point, the west coast beckoning with the promise of a wedding. The well-worn map on the dashboard traced the familiar path, a testament to countless family adventures. Dad, ever the outdoorsman, reveled in these trips. Hiking trails, historical markers, and hidden waterfalls, his enthusiasm was infectious. My wife, a kindred spirit, embraced the thrill of the unknown, the anticipation of each new vista. As for the girls, their excitement stemmed from the sheer joy of escaping the confines of home. Mom and I, well, we were along for the ride, contented observers in this tapestry of wanderlust. The rhythm of the journey was second nature. Dad, the undisputed captain, navigated the open road. Fatigue eventually claimed him, prompting me to trade places. My wife, a self-proclaimed queen of relaxation, preferred the passenger seat, feet propped up on the dashboard, a chair. Mom, ever the nurturer, found solace in the back with the girls, weaving stories and laughter in the RV's cozy living area. The whispers had started before the trip, covert suggestions about hidden cameras and voice recorders. Evidence, they urged, was the key. This voyage, I reasoned, presented the perfect opportunity. A strategically placed device could pierce the veil of secrecy, exposing the truth about this unsettling dynamic. Dad, bless his unsuspecting heart, agreed to a detour, a quick stop at a Best Buy nestled amidst the sprawl of a random town. My mission, 2 voice-activated recorders. Their purpose remained hazy, a desperate hope clinging to the fringes of my mind. Perhaps they'd capture something, a conversation snippet that would illuminate the murky depths of their relationship. With the recorders tucked discreetly within my bag, I settled back into the passenger seat. Dad, oblivious, focused on the road ahead. Under the cloak of invisibility, I placed one recorder beneath the seat, a silent sentinel awaiting its moment. My wife, ever predictable, would eventually occupy my vacated space. As anticipated, she joined Dad in the front, the rhythmic hum of the engine our soundtrack. I retreated to the living area, laptop propped open in a semblance of work. The dissonance gnawed at me. How could she be so nonchalant, so utterly composed in the presence of someone she claimed threatened our family? The surreal quality of it all choked the air, leaving me gasping for answers. My role, my very identity as a husband and a father, felt under siege. This violation, this unspoken betrayal, reduced me to a helpless observer, robbed of my agency. The miles stretched into a relentless tapestry. Dad's weariness forced me behind the wheel twice, offering a temporary respite. Finally, the majestic silhouette of the Grand Canyon announced our penultimate stop. We spent the night at the Grand Canyon National Park, a picnic under the vast expanse of the sky offering a fleeting moment of peace. Here, nestled amongst the towering cliffs and whispering winds, I retrieved the first recorder. The captured conversations were mostly mundane, punctuated by a single jarring exchange. Dad, his voice laced with a desperate yearning, asked about her distance. Her response, clipped and emotionless, echoed in the silence. I'm busy. We already went over this. Over 22 hours on the road, the weight of it all pressing down. We reached our destination on Saturday morning, the wedding a looming event on the horizon. The plan, park the RV, rent a hotel room for a night, then spend the next 2 days meandering along the coast before returning home. As they settled into their separate hotel room, I discreetly left the second recorder running. The wedding ceremony beckoned, but my mind was a war zone, consumed by the echoes of what might be transpiring across the hall. What secrets lay hidden within the confines of that small room? What story would the voice recorder capture this time? The wedding festivities unfolded in a surreal blur. My absence at the rehearsal dinner raised an eyebrow from my cousin, but I brushed it off with a hollow assurance that everything was fine. My sister, flanked by her family, graced the ceremony with their presence. The children, for the most part, found amusement in the company of my mom, niece, and nephew. Dad, throughout the ceremony, remained glued to my sister's side, while my wife sat beside him. My gaze, however, remained tethered to them, a prisoner of suspicion. A brief, shared disappearance during the ceremony fueled my unease. Was it paranoia, or was there something more sinister at play? Joy was a foreign concept at this wedding. Anxiety gnawed at me, turning the celebration into a torturous ordeal. As I retreated to the hotel room to change for the reception, a single thought echoed in the hollowness of my chest. What secrets lay hidden within the recording device? With trembling fingers, I pressed play. The recorder sprang to life, its audio painting a picture of my mom and dad entering the room. After my mom left with the children, the recording captured Dad's muffled promise to join them later. The silence stretched, thick with tension, before my wife's voice broke through. It wasn't a forceful no, but a hesitant plea. We can't continue to do this. What is wrong with you? Stop. Stop. Dad's mumbled response was unintelligible, swallowed by the sickening sounds of kisses. Her initial resistance, a faint no, 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 dissolved into a reluctant sigh. The nature of the sounds that followed was unmistakable, the unmistakable groans of intimacy. Each moan became more pronounced, a horrifying confirmation of my worst fears. Their illicit encounter was abruptly interrupted by a knock at the door, sending them scrambling. I envisioned a frantic rush to restore normalcy, clothes hurriedly thrown back on. My mom's unsuspecting return, a simple heading to the reception, shattered the horrifying tableau. How could she, or anyone for that matter, suspect such depravity? 13 years. The horrifying realization struck me like a physical blow. How could I have been so utterly blind? Anger, a white-hot inferno, consumed me. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the familiar fracturing into a million unrecognizable pieces. The urge to lash out, to mimic the violent acts I'd witnessed on countless television screens, was a terrifyingly real temptation. Yet, a parallel current of confusion ran beneath the anger. Why the confession on the recording? Wouldn't silence have served her better? The recording offered a glimpse, a hesitant resistance, not a forceful one. My wife, a woman of strength and physical prowess, could have ended this. But the soft no seemed to suggest a deeper complexity. Perhaps a part of her craved this forbidden connection, a secret she couldn't bring herself to sever completely. The thought, a fresh betrayal, ignited a new wave of fury. Dad wouldn't escape my wrath. The despicable predator, the pathetic excuse for a man, would face the consequences. Visions of a violent confrontation danced in my head, the urge to inflict pain a visceral echo of the one inflicted upon me. The wedding reception held no allure. Escape, the cleansing solitude of the ocean, was the only solace I craved. The California sun, breaking through the blinds, roused me from a restless sleep. Sand clung to my tuxedo, a stark reminder of the night I spent on the beach. The empty beer bottles beside me spoke volumes of the alcohol I'd consumed, a desperate attempt to numb the pain. 7:00 a.m. The previous 16 hours were a hazy blur, a void filled with the stench of betrayal and the bitter sting of self-loathing. How could my own father, the man entrusted with my well-being, sink so low? The enormity of the situation threatened to drown me, leaving me gasping for air. The facade of my marriage, built over years, crumbled before my eyes. The recording, a cruel revealer of truth, confirmed my worst fears. All bets were off. This web of deceit, this betrayal that festered for an unknown amount of time, demanded exposure. I wouldn't be a silent victim. The evidence was a damning choir, a symphony of whispers captured on the recorder. The intimacy between my wife and my father left no room for doubt. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I marched towards the hotel, a storm brewing within. A familiar crowd congregated outside, my dad, my sister, my wife, even my cousin and his friends. Their surprise, etched on their faces, deepened with the news I unleashed like a verbal thunderbolt. My dad's having an affair with my wife. I roared, the words a battle cry against the injustice. Consequences? They were insignificant compared to the festering wound of betrayal. The decision was made. The ties with both of them, severed. My father, a once respected figure, now hunched under the weight of shame, avoiding my gaze. My wife, tears glistening, tried to disappear into the background, her silence a stark contrast to the accusation hanging heavy in the air. The rest, stunned into silence, their reactions mirroring my own turmoil. My sister, who perhaps knew the depths of my father's capacity for darkness, was the first to break. Her voice, laced with anger and disbelief, echoed through the street. How could you do this? The surreal scene played out like a nightmare. Pointing an accusing finger at my wife, I spat out a torrent of emotions, raw and unfiltered. Never again. The words resonated with a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. Every syllable spoken was a purge, a cleansing fire against the deceit. Inside the hotel, the echo of the drama reverberated. My mother, concerned yet unaware of the reason for my absence, was caught in the crossfire. Sharing the truth, a decision I soon regretted, chipped away at her already fragile state. My father had inflicted enough damage. This was a cruel twist of the knife. Only my sister and cousin dared to venture into the room we shared. Their presence, a testament to their loyalty, served as a lifeline in the stormy sea of emotions I was navigating. My cousin, selfless in his concern, offered to postpone his honeymoon, a gesture I could only decline, urging him to cherish this special time. The adrenaline rush subsided later that day, leaving behind a desolate landscape of grief and anger. My sister, a pillar of strength, stood by me. My daughters, oblivious to the storm raging within, offered a beacon of hope. With a heart heavy with betrayal, I booked a flight back east for my mother and daughters. The airport, a bustling hive of activity, felt strangely detached from my chaotic reality. My mother and daughters accompanied me, their presence a source of solace amidst the turmoil. Despite the pleas of my sister and cousin to stay, the need for distance, a physical and emotional separation, was paramount. Stepping back from the epicenter of the earthquake, I craved the familiar routine, a haven to numb the throbbing pain. Divorce proceedings, a grim necessity, would be initiated soon. This wasn't a marriage I wanted to salvage. The very thought of my wife returning home was repulsive. As we boarded the plane, a chaotic orchestra of emotions swirling within, the flight attendant announced our imminent departure. Wedged into separate seats, scattered across the plane, the physical distance mirrored the emotional chasm that had opened between us. The journey, a blur compared to the emotional turmoil, ended a mere 3.5 hours later. Back home, amidst the familiar surroundings, the unpacking began. It was a small step towards healing, a journey I knew would be long and arduous. The air hung heavy in my parents' living room as I helped my mom gather her belongings. Disbelief clung to her like a shroud. The revelation of my wife's betrayal mirrored in her own marriage. She too spoke of divorce, a resolution born from the wreckage. News, propelled by the wings of gossip, spread like wildfire. Phone calls from concerned siblings, aunts, and uncles became a constant hum. The public unveiling, undeniably dramatic, left a bitter aftertaste. Such intimate tragedies weren't meant for public consumption, even amongst family. It was a stain, indelible, marking not just the perpetrators, but the victim as well. An invisible shadow, a twisted amalgamation of my wife's infidelity and my father's treachery, seemed to follow me wherever I went. Whispers, like phantoms, danced on the edges of conversations. Was I tainted by their actions? Did their evil stain my very blood? The thought, a poisonous dart, lodged itself in my mind. Future holidays, Thanksgiving feasts and 4th of July barbecues, stretched before me like an unappealing landscape. Awkward reunions, heavy with unspoken truths. Regret gnawed at me. Perhaps a different approach, a more dignified silence, would have been better. Not for them, but for the shield it would have provided for my daughters, my mother, and myself. Discretion, so it seemed, was the time-worn path in such situations. A silent severing of ties, a quiet divorce, a calculated forgetting. My phone buzzed with unanswered calls from my wife. Her text messages ignored pleas falling on deaf ears. My father, a coward to the core, hadn't called me, but my mother recounted his denial, his gaslighting attempts. My own mother, it seemed, had witnessed more than she realized, stolen glances, lingering touches, near misses that could have painted a clearer picture. But her trust, a misplaced faith, had blinded her. An unsettling realization dawned. Perhaps my own naivety stemmed from the same wellspring. After the children were tucked into bed, a heart-to-heart conversation unfolded in the living room. My mother, steeped in self-blame, confessed her suspicions. She'd noticed the way my wife avoided being alone with my dad, a perplexing dance of attraction and repulsion. My father, she saw now, was enthralled, living in a fantasy he'd spun around my wife. Yet, these observations, once dismissed, now loomed large, a chorus of missed warnings. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for so long, finally clicked into place. We, mother and son, victims of different facets of the same betrayal, sat in a shared silence, the weight of truth heavy on our shoulders. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least we were no longer in the dark, navigating together the treacherous path towards healing. A knot of unease had been tightening in my wife's gut for a while now. It wasn't the extravagant gifts showered upon her and our daughters, after all. My father adored them both, and who could find fault with a generous grandparent? It was the subtler moments, the fleeting glances, the way my dad seemed to orchestrate situations to be alone with her, always under the guise of a family visit. Our houses weren't far apart, a comfortable 15-mile drive. One day, the washing machine at my parents' place conveniently decided to malfunction. My mom, ever the practical one, suggested a trip to the laundromat. There were, after all, at least 5 closer options between their house and ours. But my dad, ever the charmer, insisted it would be a perfect opportunity to see the girls again. It did seem a tad odd, considering they'd just been picked up from a visit with their grandparents a few hours earlier. Yet there I was, out of town for work, leaving my wife and daughters alone. This sudden urge to see them again, especially in my absence, felt like a puzzle piece clicking into place. According to my wife, my dad had a knack for turning situations to his advantage. My mom, bless her heart, was blissfully unaware of any underlying motives. Dad used her as a convenient excuse, a Trojan horse granting him access to my wife when I wasn't around. The more my wife recounted these incidents, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just the washing machine incident. My mom would often mention a sudden urge to visit, a visit my dad enthusiastically endorsed. Yet, upon arrival, his interest in the grandchildren would wane. He'd barely interact with them, his focus solely on my wife when I wasn't around. There were whispers too, hushed conversations, that would abruptly stop when my mom entered the room. They'd exchange flustered glances, offering unconvincing explanations that never quite fit. My wife, bless her soul, wouldn't confront them directly. But the lingering scent of her perfume on my dad's clothes after these visits became a recurring theme. It felt like a silent scream, a confirmation of the suspicions gnawing at her. The more she spoke, the more I saw it, the calculated moves, the orchestrated visits, the convenient excuses. My dad, always the generous one, showering my wife and daughters with gifts, using my mom's innocent desire to see her grandchildren as a smokescreen. It was a slow burn, a simmering pot of suspicion that finally boiled over, leaving me with a tangled mess of emotions and a truth I could no longer ignore. A cold dread had settled in my stomach as my mom's words echoed in my mind. The seemingly endless stream of designer shoes and handbags my wife possessed suddenly made a lot more sense. I always knew she loved shopping, but even with our modest income, her collection bordered on extravagant. She'd always deflect my curiosity with a wave of her hand, claiming she was a couponing queen and could snag amazing deals. Now, the truth felt like a punch to the gut. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. My wife's constant requests for money from my dad, her aversion to being alone with him, it all pointed to a dynamic far more sinister than financial assistance. My mom mentioned how my dad would sometimes lie, claiming I was too embarrassed to ask for help with our finances, so she was taking care of it through my wife. Shame burned in my chest. That night, sleep was a distant dream. The following day, fueled by a potent mix of anger and betrayal, I changed the locks on our house. My phone buzzed incessantly with my wife's frantic calls and texts, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. Every message was a fresh wave of pain, a harsh reminder of the deception. In a desperate attempt to inflict some semblance of pain in return, I emptied our joint bank account, leaving her with no access to funds. It probably wouldn't cripple her, but it was the only act of defiance I could muster in that moment. Knowing she relied heavily on credit cards, I took those as well. Without them and our bank account depleted, she was financially stranded. Flying back alone wasn't an option. I knew she wouldn't dare be seen traveling with my dad in his RV. Her texts grew more frantic, laced with apologies and pleas for explanation. But I couldn't face them yet. Thankfully, our children remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. They kept asking about their mom, and fortunately, my mom stepped in like a guardian angel, showering them with the same love and attention they were used to. Her presence gave me a sliver of hope, a belief that I could handle this, at least until we figured out our legal separation. As the day wore on, a heavy emptiness settled in. The silence where my wife's laughter used to be was deafening. But amidst the pain, a flicker of resolve ignited. I wouldn't let her actions define me. I would rebuild, starting with protecting my children and myself. It wouldn't be easy, but facing the truth, however ugly, was the first step towards healing. The insistent rapping on the door jolted me out of my brooding reverie. Mom peered through the peephole, her expression hardening. It was my wife. I braced myself and followed her to the door, a knot of anger tightening in my gut. Opening the door a crack, I delivered the words I'd rehearsed a dozen times in my head. "You're not welcome here." She stood there, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman I once knew. Exhaustion etched lines on her face, her voice barely a whisper as if fearing the neighbors might eavesdrop. No luggage accompanied her, a stark reminder that she wasn't returning home. Rented a hotel, probably with money from my dad or her parents, the source of bitter mystery. "I don't want a scene," she pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. "I just want to talk, like adults. You haven't been answering my calls or texts." A flicker of resentment flared. There wasn't much to say, was there? "For the sake of our daughters," she pressed, pushing forward slightly. "We need to figure things out. We can't let this impact them negatively." A part of me wanted to slam the door, to shut out the weight of her betrayal. But ignoring her wasn't an option, not with two innocent girls caught in the crossfire. Still, the thought of letting her back inside sent shivers down my spine. The sight of her would unleash a torrent of emotions I wasn't ready to face. And worse, my daughters would sense their mother's presence and want nothing more than to be in her arms. "We can't talk inside," I stated, my voice firm. "They'd want to see you." She seemed to deflate a little, a flicker of understanding crossing her eyes. "All right, let's just talk somewhere then." We settled on a spot in front of the garage, bathed in the harsh glare of the afternoon sun. She started by acknowledging the obvious, that what happened was wrong, a betrayal she deeply regretted. The words hung in the air, hollow and lacking the sincerity I craved. But it was a start, a crack in the wall she'd built between us. I listened, a part of me yearning for the truth, another part bracing myself for the pain it might bring. Her voice trailed off, laced with a quiet desperation. She admitted she'd naively believed the situation would somehow vanish, a foolish hope fueled by the weight of the circumstances. "Understanding," she said, "if forgiveness was beyond me, but pleaded for me to read a letter, a confession she'd penned, before making any final decisions." With a trembling hand, she passed me the envelope, its weight a tangible representation of the secret she'd harbored for so long. She mentioned she'd be staying at the hotel but needed her car keys and a few essentials. The kids, thankfully, were fast asleep, allowing a brief window for her to retrieve her belongings. I stood guard, my heart a tangled mess of emotions, as she entered the house. The silence was broken only by the soft rustle of clothes and the muffled clink of a jewelry box. 45 minutes later, she emerged, a single suitcase and a tear-streaked face the only evidence of her visit. Alone again, the weight of the letter settled heavily in my hands. "Dear," I began, the words blurring as a wave of emotions washed over me. Yet a sliver of curiosity flickered within. Perhaps within those pages lay the answers I craved, the missing pieces of the puzzle that had shattered our lives. And so I decided to share her story with you, a raw and unfiltered glimpse into the betrayal that had left me reeling. The letter started with an apology, a heartfelt plea for forgiveness for the pain she'd inflicted. She called me the love of her life, a stark contrast to the deceit that had unfolded. The happiest moments, she wrote, were shared with me, a painful reminder of the life we'd built together. Gratitude, too, for our children and for the unwavering support I'd always offered. Then came the confession, a narrative that sent chills down my spine. The advances, she admitted, began during her college years while working for my father. His behavior, inappropriate and unwelcome, had filled her with dread. Fear, however, had kept her silent. The already strained relationship between me and my father, she reasoned, would only crack further under the weight of her revelation. So she endured, hoping the situation would resolve itself with the end of the school year. But the manipulation continued, relentless pressure that ultimately led to her quitting the job. A week of silence followed, a desperate attempt to escape his clutches. Yet, the reprieve proved temporary. His apologies, a barrage of texts and extravagant gifts, were a calculated attempt to regain control. Shame burned in my throat, a bitter aftertaste to her confession. She painted a picture of vulnerability, a young woman easily manipulated by my father's advances. His apologies, I imagined them laced with false sincerity, a calculated move to silence her. The fear of damaging our already strained relationship, a weapon he wielded with cunning precision. Naivete, she called it. a harsh but perhaps fitting description of her decision to stay silent. Days bled into weeks, a false sense of security shattered by his renewed pursuit. Compliments morphed into unwanted touches, a slow, insidious escalation that culminated in a horrifying betrayal. Relief washed over her as she finally confessed the act, a confession laced with regret for not revealing the full truth. Finding the right words, she explained, had felt like navigating a minefield, the fear of my reaction a constant weight on her chest. Leaving his employ became the only escape, a desperate attempt to break free from his web of manipulation. Years passed, a delicate dance of avoidance punctuated by his financial strings. He dangled money like a carrot, a cruel reminder of the power he held over her. Their encounters, she insisted, were infrequent, a mere 9 instances over the course of a decade. Each time, resistance gave way to a suffocating fear, a hostage situation where the truth was the bargaining chip. Her words hung heavy in the air, a painful tapestry woven from fear, manipulation, and a desperate need to escape. Anger simmered within me, a potent cocktail fueled by betrayal and a sickening sense of violation. Yet, beneath the rage, a sliver of empathy flickered. The young woman she described, naive and easily manipulated, felt a world away from the wife I thought I knew. The road to forgiveness, I knew, would be long and arduous, but her confession, however fragmented, was a tentative first step. Her confession felt incomplete, a puzzle with missing pieces. 9 encounters, she claimed, a stark contrast to the reality she described. Hundreds of unwanted advances, a relentless pursuit that spanned years. Shame gnawed at her, a confession laced with the burden of protecting my feelings. She couldn't bear shattering the fragile image of my father, the man I desperately craved approval from. The truth, however, was far uglier. 3 other women, their lives entangled with his deceit. Sex workers, some of them, a sickening detail that painted a picture of a man devoid of morals. Ending it, she insisted, had been her constant struggle, a battle against his escalating aggression. He preyed on her moments of vulnerability, opportunistic attempts at intimacy that disregarded even the presence of our daughters. Fear was a constant companion, a suffocating presence that intensified in my absence. A relentless barrage of calls and manipulative texts, a psychological warfare designed to wear her down. Blocking his number offered temporary relief, but he found new avenues, my mother, our daughters, all pawns in his twisted game. Entrapment, she called it, a web spun from her youthful naivete and a misplaced desire for control. The urge to confide in me, a constant battle against the fear of shattering our family. A flicker of hope, perhaps, that she could extricate herself without triggering a domino effect of destruction. But the final revelation shattered the remnants of trust. The escape plan, the desperate plea to abandon everything and run away with him, a betrayal that cut deeper than any infidelity. The seeds of doubt, I realized, had been sown long before this final act. The recent hotel rendezvous, a secret captured on a video recording, a sickening confirmation of her duplicity. The path forward, though clouded with uncertainty, was clear. A skilled divorce attorney ensured a swift and amicable resolution. She conceded everything, relinquishing her claim to our shared house and agreeing to joint custody of our daughters. Communication was reduced to the bare essentials, a bridge built solely for the sake of our children. A medical checkup confirmed my physical well-being, a reassurance in the face of her betrayal. The DNA test, a final step in a nightmarish journey, brought a sliver of relief. My daughters, at least, were a source of undeniable truth in this ocean of lies. The road to healing would be long, a process of rebuilding trust not just in others, but in myself. Her letter, a painful reminder of the past, served as a catalyst, a spark that ignited a fire of determination. I would emerge from this stronger, a single father ready to navigate the uncharted waters of the future with my daughters by my side. I am grateful that I made the effort to contact my father to understand his perspective, although he lacked the courage to face me. He moved to a different part of town and has become almost completely disconnected from everyone, including my sister and other relatives. We rarely hear from him, and honestly, that suits me perfectly. The only explanation he offered was his assumption that I wouldn't marry her because she was my first girlfriend. It's astonishing and deeply troubling that he attempted to take away his own son's wife in such a disgraceful manner. His actions were nothing short of reprehensible, and it's hard to fathom how he could stoop to such a level.